feel the time was right to do this?
Yeah, well, I didn't really think about it.
Archival footage of George Harrison on stage, his guitar glowing under the spotlight, contrasted with candid interviews where he speaks with his signature dry wit. George Harrison, known as the quiet Beatle, was often reserved, spiritual, and contemplative. Yet beneath his calm exterior, Harrison was also fiercely opinionated, never afraid to speak his mind when it came to music. While the world adored him for his talent and humility, those who knew George closely understood that he carried strong dislikes, especially toward certain bands that he believed lacked authenticity, creativity, or integrity. For decades, fans speculated about George's true feelings. Rumors swirled about who he respected in the music industry and, more importantly, who he dismissed. But only in later years, through interviews, writings, and candid remarks, did George begin to reveal what fans had long wondered, the bands he truly could not stand. This wasn't hatred in the tabloid sense of the word. George wasn't one for personal vendettas or petty grudges. Instead, his disdain often came from disappointment. Bands he felt represented commercialism over artistry, or musicians who failed to live up to the spiritual and creative ideals that he valued. Tonight, we uncover the 6 bands George Harrison openly criticized and, at times, outright rejected. From surprising choices among the biggest names in rock to lesser-known acts he found uninspired. George's candid opinions reveal not only his personal tastes, but also his vision for what music should be. The quiet Beatle may not have spoken often, but when he did, his words carried weight. And what he revealed about these 6 bands might just change how you see him and the music of his era forever. Black and white photos of George Harrison in the early Beatles years, sitting quietly while John and Paul dominated interviews, his expression thoughtful but guarded. George Harrison was often described as the quiet Beatle, the soft-spoken member of the band who let his guitar do most of the talking. But those who truly knew him understood that George was far from silent. He simply chose his words carefully. When he did speak, his opinions carried not only wit, but also a sharp edge of honesty. And one of the topics that stirred the most passion in him was music itself, especially bands he felt missed the point of true artistry. George's philosophy toward music was deeply rooted in authenticity. Unlike many artists chasing commercial success, George sought spiritual fulfillment and genuine creativity. He believed music had the power to heal, to elevate consciousness, and to inspire deeper thought. This outlook often put him at odds with the mainstream music industry, which he viewed as too obsessed with fame, money, and shallow trends. It was from this perspective that George developed strong dislikes for certain bands. He wasn't afraid to voice them either, though often in his trademark understated humor. In interviews, biographies, and conversations with close friends, he made it clear that not every act of his generation impressed him, and sometimes his criticism surprised even his most loyal fans. The first band George often spoke about with irritation was Led Zeppelin. While many considered them one of the most influential rock groups of all time, George wasn't impressed. He admitted to admiring Jimmy Page's talent as a guitarist, but he criticized the band's heavy sound and what he saw as a lack of subtlety. In his eyes, their music was too loud, too indulgent, and missing the melodic sophistication he valued. He once joked that their songs felt more like a wall of noise than an artistic statement. Yet George's dismissal wasn't pure disdain. It reflected his vision of music. He admired quiet beauty, thoughtful arrangements, and the blending of Eastern and Western traditions. To him, Led Zeppelin's bombastic style was the opposite of what he was seeking artistically. Fans were shocked that one of rock's greatest guitarists could so casually dismiss another legendary group. But that was George, unapologetically honest, even when it risked controversy. Cut to footage of Harrison performing "Here Comes the Sun," interspersed with clips of Led Zeppelin on stage, 2 worlds of rock music, side by side but miles apart in spirit. George Harrison's critique of Led Zeppelin set the tone for his opinions on other bands he disliked. He wasn't shy about separating hype from artistry, and his words revealed not bitterness, but a belief that music should mean something more than just sound and spectacle. As we explore the other bands George placed on his mental blacklist, a clearer picture emerges. The quiet Beatle wasn't just quietly critical. He had a sharp ear, high standards, and little patience for music that didn't align with his philosophy. Closing shot, George strumming his sitar during meditation, a stark contrast to the booming riffs of Zeppelin, symbolizing his deeper search for meaning through music. Archival footage of George Harrison in the mid-1970s, his hair long, his expression more confident, as he spoke openly in interviews without the shadow of the Beatles looming over him. As George Harrison grew older, he became increasingly vocal about the music industry. Free from the overwhelming fame of being a Beatle, he no longer had to play diplomat. Instead, he embraced honesty, sometimes brutally so, when discussing bands that didn't resonate with him. One of his sharpest criticisms was aimed at the Doors. While the group, led by Jim Morrison, was hailed as groundbreaking and poetic by fans, George found their music pretentious and self-indulgent. He admitted that Morrison had charisma, but he felt the band's sound was uneven, weighed down by what he described as overblown theatrics. George disliked music that, in his eyes, valued shock over sincerity. Where many heard philosophy and rebellion, George heard noise masquerading as depth. For him, the Doors embodied what he feared most in rock, style eclipsing substance. Another band that drew his ire was the Sex Pistols. Punk exploded in the late 1970s, positioning itself as the antithesis to the polished rock of the previous decade. While Harrison respected the idea of rebellion, he saw the Pistols' work as chaotic, crude, and destructive, rather than constructive. He was quoted as saying punk was a bit silly, and he dismissed its musicality entirely. To George, music wasn't supposed to tear down for the sake of tearing down. It was supposed to build, uplift, and inspire. The Pistols' anti-establishment rage simply didn't fit with his spiritual and artistic values. What made these revelations surprising is that Harrison wasn't known for fiery outbursts like John Lennon or sharp critiques like Paul McCartney. His distaste carried more weight precisely because he rarely voiced such negativity. When George disliked a band, it wasn't gossip. It was a statement rooted in his core beliefs about art. Even with his disdain, George wasn't cruel. He often balanced criticism with acknowledgement. For example, while he dismissed the Doors as overly theatrical, he admitted Morrison had a powerful presence. With the Pistols, he noted they captured a moment in time, even if he didn't respect the music itself. This nuanced approach revealed George's depth. He didn't simply hate. He evaluated music against his deeply personal standards of authenticity and artistry. Cut to montage. The Doors performing Light My Fire, alongside clips of the Sex Pistols in chaotic shows, contrasted with George quietly strumming an acoustic guitar, lost in melody. Fans may have been shocked to learn of George's dislikes, but they shouldn't have been surprised. His criticisms fit perfectly with his broader journey. A man who rejected superficial fame, who searched for truth through spirituality, and who believed music was sacred. In many ways, George's negative opinions revealed as much about his ideals as his positive ones. By the late 70s, Harrison's perspective had crystallized. He valued sincerity, craftsmanship, and spirituality in music, and he had little patience for acts he felt relied on gimmicks or aggression. As more interviews surfaced, it became clear that the Doors and the Sex Pistols weren't alone on his blacklist. Closing shot, George smiling faintly in an interview, leaning back in his chair, almost amused at the hype surrounding certain bands, his silence speaking louder than words. 80s footage of George Harrison at Friar Park, relaxed yet contemplative, giving interviews where he no longer filtered his opinions for the sake of politeness. By the 1980s, George Harrison had fully embraced his independence from the Beatles' shadow. He was older, wiser, and more comfortable being candid about his views. His criticisms of certain bands revealed not only personal taste, but also deep frustrations with what the music industry had become. Two more names soon joined the list of groups that George openly dismissed. The fourth band was Kiss. Known for their elaborate costumes, Makeup and over-the-top stage antics, Kiss embodied the spectacle of rock and roll, but to George, their image was a distraction from the music. He reportedly felt that their songs lacked the depth and craftsmanship he admired in true artistry. To him, Kiss represented the commercialization of rock, a product more than an expression. While fans were enthralled by fire-breathing theatrics and arena-shaking shows, George saw a hollow spectacle that cheapened what music could be. In his mind, Kiss was more circus than substance. The fifth band he criticized was Oasis. Though Oasis rose to fame decades after the Beatles, George never warmed to their swaggering Britpop sound or their endless comparisons to his own band. He disliked their arrogance, once famously saying in the 1990s that Oasis reminded him of the Ruddles, a parody group mocking the Beatles. To George, their music was derivative, recycling ideas without bringing true originality. The Gallaghers' constant references to the Beatles didn't flatter him. They frustrated him. Where the world saw Oasis as heirs to the Beatles' legacy, George saw imitators leaning too heavily on nostalgia. What makes these criticisms fascinating is how they reflected George's evolving relationship with fame and his own past. Having lived through the frenzy of Beatlemania, he was deeply skeptical of bands that relied on hype, controversy, or image. He had seen firsthand how fame could consume and destroy, and he resented acts that seemed to invite chaos rather than seek meaning. Yet, as always, George's critiques weren't entirely dismissive. He recognized that Kiss had an undeniable impact on rock performance and that Oasis captured the energy of a new generation. But admiration for influence didn't equal respect for artistry. He held music to a higher standard, one defined not by ticket sales or headlines, but by authenticity, originality, and spiritual depth. Cut to archival clips, Kiss performing in full costume before screaming crowds, followed by Oasis swaggering through interviews, contrasted with George playing quietly on his guitar in a small studio session. These revelations also highlight Harrison's blunt honesty. Unlike many rock legends who avoided controversy, George didn't mind admitting when something didn't resonate with him. Fans admired him for this, even when they disagreed. His willingness to call out popular bands showed a confidence rooted not in ego, but in conviction. By the mid-1990s, George had made peace with much of his past, but his disdain for what he saw as shallow or recycled music never softened. Whether criticizing Kiss's theatrics or Oasis's brash self-promotion, George was clear. Music, for him, had to be more than a business or a brand. It had to be sincere. Closing shot. George, in an interview, smiling wryly as he brushes off a question about modern rock bands, his silence once again speaking volumes. A twilight view of Friar Park, George Harrison's beloved estate, with his guitar resting against a chair. The narration shifts into the closing reflections of his often misunderstood candor. As George Harrison grew older, his opinions about music became even sharper, yet more philosophical. He had long outgrown the need to impress anyone, and if he didn't like a band, he would simply say so without apology. The sixth and final band on his list was the Sex Pistols, the punk group that exploded onto the British scene in the late 1970s. For George, the Sex Pistols embodied everything he disliked about modern music: chaos, shock value, and aggression without depth. Their anti-establishment attitude resonated with many, but George saw it as destructive rather than constructive. To him, the Pistols weren't revolutionaries. They were provocateurs. Their rebellion lacked the spirituality, melody, and heart he valued in music. George once commented that punk, while energetic, felt empty, anger without resolution. Unlike the Beatles, who sought to expand minds and open hearts, the Sex Pistols thrived on outrage. That, in George's eyes, wasn't artistry, but noise. But here's what made George fascinating. His criticisms weren't just about taste. They revealed his deeper philosophy about life and music. He believed that music should lift people up, connect them to something greater, and inspire peace. Bands like the Sex Pistols and even Kiss, Oasis, or Led Zeppelin failed that test in his mind. For him, it wasn't about popularity or talent. It was about purpose. Cut to archival footage, the Sex Pistols' chaotic live performances, with fights breaking out in the crowd, contrasted with George's serene concerts where audiences swayed peacefully to songs like My Sweet Lord. When we look at the 6 bands George Harrison disliked most, Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, the Monkees, Kiss, Oasis, and the Sex Pistols, a pattern emerges. He wasn't just lashing out randomly. He was consistent. He distrusted bands that relied heavily on image, hype, or aggression. He dismissed groups that recycled the past without bringing something new. And above all, he criticized those who treated music as a product rather than a path to truth. Yet, George's honesty didn't come from bitterness. In many ways, it came from disappointment. He knew music could be transcendent because he had lived it, both as a Beatle and as a solo artist. When he saw bands settle for spectacle over sincerity, it saddened him. He wanted music to mean more, to do more, to heal more. By the time of his passing in 2001, George had achieved something rare: peace. He no longer cared who agreed with his opinions. He had built a life rooted in spirituality, gardening, and family, while still quietly making music that carried his soul. His dislikes, often delivered with humor or dry wit, became part of his charm. Fans respected that he never pretended to love what he didn't. Closing shot, black and white still of George Harrison smiling faintly, guitar in hand. The narrator delivers the final words. In the end, George Harrison's criticism of these 6 bands wasn't just about them. It was about his unwavering belief that music is sacred. For George, every chord, every lyric, every song had the power to touch the divine. And if a band failed to honor that, he simply couldn't embrace it. His honesty might have ruffled feathers, but it also revealed the depth of his integrity. George Harrison left behind a legacy not only as a Beatle, but as a man who reminded us that music is more than entertainment, it's a spiritual journey. And perhaps that's why, even today, his words still resonate.